All right, well, we're going to go ahead and get started so that we can stay on time. Again, welcome to the webinar, Financial Aid 201. My name is Faith Phillips, and I am the Director of Student Financial Services at Central Ohio Technical College and The Ohio State University at Newark. Also presenting with me today is Veronica Davidson, who is the Director of Financial Aid at the Modern College of Design. We are pleased that you're able to join us today. We welcome any of the questions that you may have. Please use the Q&A to put your questions into the Q&A section. We do have a few staff members that are monitoring the Q&A for us. So we do welcome your questions as we go along through the webinar. If they have see some questions that they feel might be beneficial to the entire group, they may ask us to pause for a moment and answer those questions out loud. This presentation is being brought to you by OASFA, which is a nonprofit organization comprised of financial aid professionals. The organization that has put the presentation together is called the OASFA Outreach Committee, and we're a group of all volunteers that work to disseminate this type of information throughout a variety of activities throughout the year to various stakeholders, such as admission staff, high school counselors, access advisors, and TRIO. OASFA is providing this information to you today free of service. You are welcome to disseminate these materials to your families and your students, but you may not charge for the information. Permission must be granted for any other use of this information or these materials. So if you have any requests such as that, you may reach us at outreach@oasfa.org. Also, at the conclusion of this webinar, should you have any questions regarding the financial aid process or need assistance with any of your students, you may also reach out to the outreach committee at that email on your screen. We are providing you with a lot of information today, and we recognize that it can be overwhelming, and we never expect you to be the financial aid guru or the financial aid professional. That is our job. Our goal is to bring this information to you so that you can better assist your students through some of the basic questions. But if they are presenting you with questions that you're uncomfortable answering, you can always reach out to the outreach committee. So we're going to get started, and we're going to start talking about FAFSA completion numbers. So in the state of Ohio, as of February the 4th, you can see where we are with the FAFSA completion numbers. Ohio is slightly above the national average in FAFSA completion numbers, but we still have some work to do in the state of Ohio in getting students to complete the FAFSA form. And we recognize that the pandemic has presented a challenge for families in getting the information they need in order to submit the FAFSA form, or if they're at a level where they're uncomfortable in submitting the FAFSA form, finding those resources to support them. So we're hoping as we're coming out of this pandemic that we will be able to work to increase those FAFSA completion numbers in the state of Ohio. So nationally, the class of 22 is up 0.7% compared to last year. So clearly, coming out of this pandemic, we are able to get to families and reminding them that FAFSA completion is necessary upon high school graduation for students that are planning to enter college in the fall. 15 states have had an increase this year. As of February 4th, the Ohio class of 22 was down 0.2% compared to the class of 2021 in the state of Ohio. So nationally, we're up, but in the state of Ohio, we're down. Ohio has the 13th highest completion rate in the country, with 39.6% of the class of 2022 completing that FAFSA form. So that's not a bad place for the state of Ohio to be. And a lot of credit goes to our Department of Higher Education, because they have done many activities this past year in trying to increase the FAFSA completion, specifically reaching out to OASFA and asking how we can assist in getting those numbers up. Ohio has remained flat in the number of completed FAFSA since the beginning of December. So that push that went out when the FAFSA went live October 1 saw students increasing and getting out there, but those numbers are declining now or has stayed flat. So we still need to keep that push on. We know that the FAFSA deadline is not, has not come. So we need to continue to push for those students to complete the FAFSA for the 22-23 year. FAFSA rates are up 3 to 4% for Title I schools and high schools with a high minority population. So that is also good news. You are able to track FAFSA completions for your school. You can look at aggregate numbers and compare them at this website, formyourfuture.org. This is just numbers so that you can see a comparison. You compare this year versus last year at the state, city, district, and building level. You can also have access to student level data for the state of Ohio here at this website. But in order for you to access that, you need to have a data sharing agreement that is signed by your superintendent, giving you permission to see that student level data. So if you're interested to see at your high school or your organization, which students have and have not completed the FAFSA form, once you have that access by your superintendent, you can go to this website and get the 22-23 FAFSA data. Many enhancements have been made to this website during the past year. So it is definitely very beneficial for you to have that access to see who of your students have submitted the FAFSA and who have not for the coming year. The Ohio class of 22 year-to-date completion, this data represents 1,100 public high schools, community schools, STEM schools, and non-public schools. 41.9% have completed. 5,769 completed apps out of 123,000 seniors. So again, we're looking at just high school seniors. So, we're at 41%. We would certainly like to see that percent higher. Ohio class of 21 completion was at 41.7% last year at this time. So again, we're doing slightly better, but still need, the push still needs to be on for getting high school seniors to get that FAFSA submitted for the 22-23 year. I'm going to now turn it over to Veronica to present on verification.
Hello, everyone. So a little bit about myself real quick. So I've been in financial aid for about 18 years now, and this verification process has definitely evolved and changed over those years. You may have heard this past year, there was actually kind of a hold or a freeze on verification because of COVID, but we anticipate for this coming fall going back to that process. And what the process is where the Department of Education is selecting students, and sometimes the school selecting students to verify that the information on their FAFSA was completed correctly, which is very important. And why we like FAFSA data to be completed correctly, because if it's not, then sometimes that can select a student and they have to go through this verification process. So roughly 18% of FAFSAs are selected for verification. That number used to be higher. It used to be around 30%. So we're happy that that's gone down. So the burden is less on those students and families. So students should respond quickly to those requests from the college for verification, because that process can take time. So we do want to encourage students and parents to respond to those quickly. If they have any questions, make sure they're getting in touch with the school to get assistance with that. If a student's not selected, again, the school may choose to select the student for verification. And there can be a number of reasons for that, but it doesn't always have to be the Department of Ed. It can sometimes be the school who's selecting the student. So next slide, please. So if selected, the documents that are normally requested are first what's called a verification worksheet. Now that can look different depending on the college or university that is requesting the information, but there is some standard information that's collected, and we're going to look at a couple examples here in a minute. Federal tax return transcript. So that comes directly from the IRS and basically shows what was filed by the student and or parent for their 2020 taxes. So it's not the same as the tax form, the 1040 that they file. It's an actual document from the IRS showing that they were filed with the IRS. W-2s. So if the parent or student worked but did not file taxes, the W-2s would show their income information, and that would be needed. Or if they did not file taxes, there's what's called a verification of non-filing letter. So parents and independent students who did not file taxes would need that form. And that again is requested through the IRS and can be requested through their website. Next slide, please. So here's a couple documents that show UC has provided their verification worksheet, the first page there. And then the second page we pulled, that's the Department of Ed kind of standard page, just to show you kind of the information that's collected. So that does include household size. So who is being supported in the household by the parent or student themselves, the number in college. Now, if the student still lives at home and the parents included, they do not put themselves as in college. I know that can be confusing, but that's one of the questions that's on the FAFSA that, we're just, again, verifying that that's correct. And that can be one of the reasons why they get selected. If there's everybody in the households in college, then we have to kind of look at that. Tax filing status, again, or W-2 information, and then there are signatures required. Now, for some schools, this process is done electronically, and it would be an electronic signature. Some schools are still using paper, so it would be, good old paper and pen, and the student parent would sign. If they're a dependent student, if they're an independent student, then just the student would sign. So next, please. So federal income tax return. So institutions can accept a signed copy of the federal tax return for the year that's being requested. Now, again, for this coming fall, it will be the 2020 taxes. So that would include a signed copy of the income tax return for amended tax filers and victims of identity theft, because theirs looks a little different than regular filing. So the IRS tax return transcripts, again, they can be requested through the IRS, and there's a link they can go to, an 800 number they can call. Now, the 800 number can be a little complicated sometimes, but most of the time you can request that information fairly easily through the IRS. You can no longer have them mailed directly to the school. That used to be an option where the student or parent could request that the information came directly to the school. Unfortunately, that's no longer available. But again, they've tried to make it easier to request via online or by phone. Next slide, please. So some important things about verification. Families often think they did something wrong or they're being picked on, and that's why they're selected for verification, which is absolutely not the case. Again, we're just trying to make sure that the information was correct, that was reported on the FAFSA, so that they're actually getting the aid that they're eligible to receive. So financial aid administrators, as much as people think we are not tax experts. So federal student aid does require us to know the correct filing status, though. That's part of what we do have to verify on that FAFSA information. So financial aid administrators also have authority to request additional information if needed. And we can also request that a tax filing status be amended to the correct status. And until that information is received, the student is not eligible for financial aid. So again, this is all very important, and it goes back to how that FAFSA is completed to begin with. So making sure to ask any questions or having your students ask questions if they're unsure is really important. And that's why we're here at the Outreach Committee to help you guys if you need any assistance with that process. Next slide, please, Faith. So I'm going to turn it back to Faith, and we're going to talk about what are called special circumstances.
All right. So we do recognize, and so does FSA, that conditions exist that cannot be explained or documented on the FAFSA form. And the primary example that we see, or the most common example, is a loss or reduction of employment wages or unemployment compensation, or a loss of an untaxed benefit such as child support. But we also see where a family has submitted the FAFSA, and after they have submitted the FAFSA, there has been a separation, a divorce, or a death of a parent or spouse. And that is not something that is really updatable on the FAFSA form, but something that we could take into consideration if that circumstance occurs. Also not as common, but another option would be unusual or uncovered medical or dental expenses. So if a family is paying for significant medical or dental expenses out of pocket after insurance is paid, a financial aid administrator could take that into consideration, that the income reported is a certain amount, but a portion of that is going to pay off those medical or dental expenses. And then extraordinary dependent care expenses. So take, for example, a family that has a disabled child and they have to pay expenses for dependent care while they're at work. We could take that into consideration. And this is not all of the examples. These are just some of the common examples that we see that cannot be addressed on the FAFSA form. So if you are working with a family or a student who is saying, yes, we're reporting this amount of income, but we have this unusual scenario, even if it's not listed here or something that you've heard before, definitely encourage that family to reach out to the financial aid administrator where they've applied for financial aid to discuss the circumstance with them and let the financial aid administrator determine whether or not that is something that we could take into consideration. Eligibility for aid for the 22-23 year is based on income, taxable and untaxable, that was earned in 2020. But here we are, in March now of 2022. So we recognize that what we're capturing on the FAFSA for 2020 income may not be indicative of the current family situation, especially given the pandemic and what happened to families and income during the 2020 and the 2021 year. And so now more than ever, financial administrators are prepared to hear from families about these special circumstances that occurred in 2020 and 2021. Financial aid may be evaluated on these special circumstances on a case-by-case basis that better reflects a family's financial picture. So we have to look at each scenario individually. If a student has submitted the FAFSA to more than one college or university and they have a special circumstance, they will need to reach out to each of those financial aid offices to explain that circumstance and go through the appeal process. And it's a time-consuming process, but we know that they want to see a financial aid award notification that reflects their current situation. So they will want to take the time to reach out to each of those colleges and universities to do that appeal with them to see, how that could change their financial aid offer. Students must first submit the FAFSA as it directs using the 2020 income before they can even consider these special circumstances. And as I mentioned, most colleges have a procedure that addresses these special circumstances. Students will be asked to provide documentation, which may include first and foremost, just an explanation, a written explanation of the special circumstance, and then some type of documentation that supports their statement. So if they're providing us with an explanation that a family member lost their job or their income was cut, we would want a copy of that layoff or termination letter. For 21 or 22 parent student income, we could also look at W-2s, pay stubs, or other sources of earned or anticipated income. So, and each school may vary based on what they are asking the student to provide. Colleges will then review and determine if the change would impact the student's eligibility. So, it actually may benefit the student to reach out to the financial aid administrator before they begin the process to see if there's even any room for change. So take, for example, a family that already has a zero expected family contribution. A loss in income would not change the student's eligibility. They're already at the lowest family contribution. They would not be eligible for more federal aid, but that could somehow impact institutional dollars. So they certainly would want to ask, but we don't want families to go through the appeal process to find out that they're already at the maximum amount of aid and the appeal would not benefit them. As I mentioned, if they're applying to more than one college, they will need to submit an appeal at each of those schools. Appeal decisions are at the discretion of the college financial aid administrator and they're final. So if the family disagrees with the decision that the financial aid administrator made, they may not appeal that to FSA. FSA will not entertain those. Verification, if the student was selected, has to be completed on the 2020 taxable and untaxable income first before a school can look at an income appeal. So if a family sees they've been selected for verification, but they know they have a special circumstance and they want to bypass that verification process, they can't do that. We have to verify that what was first submitted on the FAFSA was accurate before we can look at doing an income appeal. And also, as I mentioned, colleges are prepared to see more appeals right now as a result of the pandemic. So please make sure that you're sharing this information and these options to students and parents so that they don't miss out on an opportunity to maximize their aid eligibility based on any special circumstances they may have. So most colleges do have an appeal form available. That is the best way for a student to identify to us that they have these special circumstances. Some schools have them available on their website, but other schools we have found have them embedded in their school portal, for example. And so when a student is admitted to a college, they are given access to a school portal if they have one. So some schools do not allow students to have access to these forms unless they've logged into the school portal. So if you go looking on a school's website, you may not find it because the student needs to log into the portal. But what we have found is those colleges have put information on their website that says, we have an appeal process, the student needs to log into the portal to access the forms. Also, the appeal form may vary by title. So we've seen, expected family contribution appeal. We've seen income appeal, special circumstance appeal, change of income appeal. So you may be looking at 4 different schools and see that they have 4 different titles for what ultimately is the same thing. So just, helping families understand that those appeal forms will look different, but in the end contain probably the same content. There is a free resource to assist families in writing their appeals that we have found, and here is the link, and it just helps them put into words what their special circumstance is when they are submitting those appeal forms. So here you can see 2 examples of an income appeal form. At COTC, we call it an income appeal for independent students. So we have a separate form whether the student is independent or dependent. At OSU, our form is an expected family contribution appeal form, and it is for dependent and independent students. So just kind of gives you an idea of the different look and feel. At the end of the day, these appeal forms tend to get to the same response. We just ask the questions in a different manner. Some of the forms are 2 pages long. Some of the appeal forms could be 3-4 pages long, just depending on the information, the detail, and how it's been presented to the student. Here's another example for OU. They call theirs a special circumstance form. And here is an example. UC is one of those schools that puts the form in their student portal. So the student has to log into UC's portal in order to access it. So here is the information that they have on their website that says, explains that the special circumstance review form is available. It encourages them to speak with a staff member first about their situation, which we would encourage all students to do at every school. And then they will log into the UC portal in order to access the award notification, or excuse me, in the special circumstance form. So again, I can't stress enough, especially in these bizarre times that we have been experiencing, that you're communicating with your students and families. If they bring award notifications to you and say, we have no idea how we're going to come up with the difference, I would probe a little bit and say, have you experienced a loss of income or a change in circumstances in the last few years, and encourage them to reach out to the financial aid office to discuss their special circumstances. I'm going to turn it back over to Veronica now to talk about award notifications.
All right, so now once they get through the verification or the special circumstance and their FAFSA's all squared away, what the next step is for them to be awarded by the institution. So financial aid offer is what is the preferred language that they're calling it now, though you may have been heard it called awards. So again, different schools will use different language sometimes, but it is the same thing: offer, award, notification. So overviews provided by each college that the student listed on the FAFSA. So if the student has 10 schools on the FAFSA, they may get 10 different award or offer notifications, letting them know what they would be eligible for at each school. So the federal aid will be the same on that, but the institutional aid may be different based on institutional scholarships or other aid. So that's why it's important to kind of get all of that information together. Usually provided around the same time as the acceptance letter comes from the institution, but timing can vary from college to college, again, just depending on when they start processing that information for their next year. What that should include is what's called a cost of attendance, and then financial aid that they could expect to receive. So cost of attendance just kind of goes over the cost of what it would cost a student to go to college for a year, not necessarily just the charges from the institution, and then any federal aid or institutional aid that may be offered through the school. This typically covers one academic year, which would be 2 semesters or 3 quarters typically for an institution. And the student may have this mailed, they may get it by email, or it may be again on the college's self-service portal. Next slide, please, Faith. So what's nice about these, again, if you have multiple institutions, you're not sure where you want to go, is you can compare the offers. Now, the challenge with that is that there is no one format or template. Again, schools will use different formats or templates based on their internal processes. So not all schools list the total cost or breakout of the cost components. It may just be one number that says COA, cost of attendance, and you don't see what that exactly means. And it can be a lot of financial aid jargon or terminology that we use that we all know, but that is confusing to families. Not all schools categorize aid in the same way. So grant, work study, loan, scholarship, maybe some kind of overlap in language as well. But that's what we're going to kind of talk through over these next few slides to help you kind of dissect that and that your schools should be able to help you with it too. So if a student is, getting award notifications from multiple schools, they should be able to reach out to those financial aid offices and get some clarification if they need it as well. But if they bring it to you and say, I don't know what this is, we're going to help you break down some of that terminology. So next slide, please, Faith. So steps in comparing offers. So it will determine what's called direct and indirect costs. So direct costs would be things like tuition, fees. Indirect costs would be things like housing or meals. We'll also identify scholarship or grant opportunities, which is gift aid. So that's what we quote unquote can call free money. And I put quotes around it, which is why they call it gift aid, because it's not necessarily free, but it is gift aid that they don't have to repay necessarily. You can subtract that gift aid from the cost to identify the net cost, compare your net cost from school to school, and then subtract federal loans and work study from those net costs. So you can compare the loan types on those as well. One institution, you may be getting, just subsidized loan. Another institution, you have subsidized and unsubsidized loans, which we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. Work funds or work study funds are not subtracted from the student's bill. So that can be confusing as well. It's just funds that are available for the student to earn while they're attending or working at the institution, and those get paid directly to the student. Next slide, please. So questions for the financial aid office. What financial aid listed is renewable? So am I going to get this every year, or is this just a one-time thing? Is tuition frozen, or will it increase each year? Again, some schools use an enrollment agreement where they freeze the tuition for the day that the student signs up. Other institutions, it's going to go up every year. So those are good questions for a student or family to ask. Will the financial aid change if my enrollment status changes? That can also be important, because a lot of times what will happen on an award notification is students are shown a full-time award. It kind of defaults to full-time. So if I'm only going to attend part-time, what does that mean for me? Will the financial aid change if my housing or meal, or if I change my housing or meal options? Again, if I'm in a housing and I have a fixed price, and now I've decided I want to move to different housing, how is that going to impact things? Will the estimated financial aid decrease if the student's offered an external scholarship? So again, sometimes scholarships are applied before the federal aid. So if I get this scholarship, is it quote unquote extra money, or is it going to decrease something else? Again, work study, is this job guaranteed? Is it for one semester? How does that work? How many hours a week are guaranteed? So is this a job that's going to give me 5 hours a week or 20 hours a week? And then what is the pay rate? So again, there is no standard necessarily pay rate. The institution has some flexibility with that. So these are some questions, again, that students or families may want to ask their financial aid office. And if we can go to the next slide, Faith. So here's an example of an offer notification. So again, your estimated financial aid based on full-time attendance and on-campus housing. So there's some assumptions made with this one. And again, there are always going to be assumptions made either about the full-time attendance status or again, housing or no housing. So with this one, you see what's called that first block is saying estimated cost of attendance. So that's that tuition and fees, books and supplies. So those are more of those, again, direct costs, and then room and board, miscellaneous personal travel. So those are things they're estimating it's going to cost a student just to live while they're attending school. So you see the totals, and then they break it down between fall semester and spring semester. Now you see the estimated grant and scholarship aid in the next block. So that gift aid, there's the federal Pell Grant, scholarship, and then a grant that's offered through the college. So with those, you see that's a total of $22.50. And then federal loans and work study. There's a subsidized loan, an unsubsidized loan, and then work study. So what that's showing you there, and this is where it becomes important for families and where they're going to try to compare to see kind of what offer is proposing what, you have a total down there at the bottom. So what they're estimating it's going to cost the student to attend is the $25,400. What the estimated aid is $11,200. Okay, so that means the aid isn't necessarily going to cover the full cost of tuition fees, books, room and board, but there are other supplemental loans and things that students can receive to help with that may not be listed on here because that's a separate kind of process, and we're going to talk about those too. But those are, again, good questions. So you know, it looks like it's 25. It's going to cost my student 25,000 to go. We get 11,000. What other aid is available to help us with that? So this is, again, just one sample, and I really like this one. It's laid out very well. And we can go ahead on to the next slide, Faith. Here's another sample notification. So this one you see offers a little more detail at the top and bottom. They're giving you some kind of background information. So it's saying, you know, again, it's based on full-time enrollment. If you do not attend full-time, that's going to change things. But it gives you the budget. But here it doesn't break down those budget components, it just gives you the total budget for the year. So $26,162. The student's EFC from the FAFSA, what is considered their need, which is basically that budget minus that EFC. And then it shows you the awards down below. So again, they have some federal work study, they have some estimated student loans, some scholarships, and then it breaks it down per term. And for this school, it looks like there's summer, fall, and spring. So we got 3 different terms. So again, you see that the total aid is the $12,300, the budget $26,162. So you know, where's that difference coming? Mostly, again, with those you know, external items like housing, food, which a student may live at home, and that's not an issue. But if they're planning on living on campus and they need those costs to be covered, you know, this shows kind of what's called that gap, and where you need to find something to meet that gap so that your student can attend those terms and be successful. So Faith, if we can go on to the next slide. So there's an OASFA cost comparison sheet. This can be a great tool to help you compare those different offers and the different from the different schools. So that is available on the website. And Faith, you might help me out here. Is that on the outreach?
It's on just at oasfa.org, and we'll talk about it under resources as well.
Okay, perfect. But like I say, mostly it's nice to have a tool where you can kind of put all of that together and look at it side by side and help figure that out. So this is another resource that's made available by OASFA for families to do that. Next slide, Faith. So key terms and loan information. So with the loans, they are made available to students and parents while they're in school. And typically repayment doesn't start till after graduation. But while they are in school, there is interest accruing. So interest rate, which is the rate that's charged to borrow the money. And you know, you and I as adults in the working world may understand this, but students don't always necessarily kind of know these terms or understand what that means. So that's why we just kind of go over them briefly. And then of course, you know, you have this information to share with your students. So the higher the interest rate, the higher the total loan cost or repayment cost would be. Interest capitalizations occurs when unpaid interest is added to the amount that was borrowed. So that increases the total amount again that would be due. But there are some what are called repayment incentives where they give interest rate reductions for things like, for example, if a student has a direct withdrawal on their payments, once they do start repayment, there may be an interest rate reduction. Credits to the loan balance, and then some benefits impose eligibility requirements. So it may say to be eligible for this, you have to meet this criteria. So those are going to be based on the loan, and that information would be given to the borrowers by what's called the lender, or who's, you know, who they're repaying. So on to the next slide. So with the federal loans, again, the FAFSA makes the student eligible for 3 types of federal aid right off the bat: the federal Pell Grant if they qualify, and then what are called direct subsidized and unsubsidized loans. So the difference is the subsidized loans are eligible to all undergraduate students who demonstrate what's called that financial need. So again, what the cost of attendance is minus their what's called estimated family contribution will tell them whether they have need for the subsidized loan. What's nice about the subsidized loan is the interest is paid by the federal government while the student is in school, at least half time, and then for 6 months afterwards. So basically the student's able to borrow that loan interest-free while they're in school and for 6 months afterwards. The difference with the unsubsidized loan, this is available to undergraduate and graduate students. So graduate students, unfortunately, cannot get the subsidized. They only get the unsubsidized loan. Students are not required to show need for that loan, but even though payments are not required while they're still in school, the interest does accrue. So interest would be accruing on those loans while the student's in school and for that 6 months afterwards or until repayment. One option that is nice, though, is that the student can just pay on the interest while they're in school if they choose to, just to avoid having more interest that they're paying later. But again, they're not required to, which is nice. We can go on to the next slide. So federal direct subsidized and unsubsidized, there's some limits to the amount that the student is eligible to borrow in their own name. So for undergraduate students who are what are considered dependent, and again, that's based on the information that they provide on the FAFSA, they have a maximum their first year they can borrow of $5,500. So $3,500 of it can be in those subsidized funds, or the amounts that do not have interest accruing, and then $2,000 on unsubsidized. I think that's, we forgot a zero, but you guys get it. Then second year, it actually goes up to $6,500. So they're eligible for more of that subsidized aid. Third and final year, $7,500. So they get $5,500 in that subsidized and $2,000 in the unsubsidized. Now, for students who are considered independent, they have more eligibility for borrowing in that unsubsidized portion. But one of the nice things about the federal loans is their interest rate is fixed. It's typically fairly low, so 3.73%. And that's for loans that disperse between July 1st of last year and June 30th of this year. So what happens is every year the Department of Ed updates that interest rate, but typically they stay lower because, again, they're trying to assist students who are in school and not have a high interest rate on those. There's also, though, what's called an origination fee for those loans. The origination fee is basically money for the Department of Ed sets aside just to make those loans. So there is a cost for that. And that is, again, each year in October, that changes. Payments begin again 6 months after leaving school or graduating or dropping to less than half-time enrollment. So that can be one of the tricky things for students is they think if they start just taking one class at a time, they're still going to be able to defer their loans. Unfortunately, usually that makes them less than half-time, and then their loans would go back into repayment. So they do have to watch that half-time mark. Flexible repayment terms. So again, when they do go to repay these loans, the Department of Ed is very flexible about repayment. You know, I always tell my students just they have to make sure they keep in touch with their lender, as long as they're keeping in touch with them or the servicer of their loan. And if they have any issues, they're always going to work with them to try to help them with whatever the best repayment plan is going to be for that individual student. It's not like a normal creditor. So we can go on to the next slide. So filling the financial gap. So as you saw in a few of those offer letters earlier, sometimes we have you know, a cost of attendance that's this big and we've got aid that's this big. So what do we do to fill in the rest? Well, there are a couple of different types of aid still available. There's 2 additional loans that are available. For our dependent students, there's what's called a Federal Parent Plus loan. So that is a loan in the parent's name on the student's behalf. So the parent is eligible to borrow money on the student's behalf to assist them with filling in the gap and covering those other costs that they're not eligible for on their own. The parent does have to be a biological or adoptive parent, potentially a step parent. There is a credit check required. So the Department of Ed does what's called a soft credit check. So they will look to make sure there is no adverse credit history. So the parent does have to apply and get approved for that. Loan responsibility is the parent's and does not get transferred to the student. So this parent is, or this loan is in the parent's name and it stays in the parent's name. So that is one thing that's important that differentiates it from what's called our private education loan. So private education loan is a non-federal loan. So it's a private lender, typically a bank or organization that's providing those funds. For example, like at our school, we use PNC or College Avenue are our private lenders. But each school kind of has a set of private lenders that they work with that make these loans available. Now, these can be in the student's name, but typically, especially if a student's straight out of high school, they require a credit-worthy cosigner because they haven't established any credit yet. So, you know, that ends up being the case a lot of times. Now, an independent student who may be you know, have an established credit history would be able to borrow on their own. The interest rate varies, typically based on credit, but it varies between lenders as well. So like this says, shop around. So there are educational lenders and different ones, and it's important to kind of do your homework and figure out which one's going to be able to provide you with the best interest rate and the best repayment terms. But those are available to, again, assist with that gap. So on to the next slide. So how do you apply for these loans? So for the subsidized and unsubsidized loans, that again is part of the FAFSA application. So there is no additional loan application. The student again may have to accept the loans though. And again, a lot of times that's done through the student portal or with the financial aid office at the institution. There are still 2 additional requirements for those loans as well though. One is called a master promissory note. So that's the student's promise to repay. And the second is what's called entrance counseling. That just makes sure the student understands their rights and responsibilities as a borrower. And those are both done at the same website where the FAFSA is completed. So the studentaid.gov. For the parent, again, the parent does have to complete a credit check in order to be eligible or an application. That is done also through the same website, studentaid.gov. The parent logs in with their parent ID and they're able to apply. Now, if a parent applies, that does not obligate them to anything. It just lets them know if they'd be accepted or not. If they are accepted and they decide to move forward with that loan, then they must complete a master promissory note as well. So there's kind of two steps for the parent. They apply and then complete the promissory note. For the private education loan, schools may require that the FAFSA be completed, but that's at the school's discretion. A lot of times there is a website or link that the student's directed to apply for those loans directly with those lenders. And again, we just encourage shopping around to make sure they're going to get the best deal. But at the same time, they don't want to apply to every place necessarily, because every time they apply, that is going to impact their credit. So just some tips for that. So we'll go to the next slide. And so repayment incentives on these loans. So with the federal subsidized and unsubsidized loan, again, the borrower can reduce their interest rate by 0.25% if they do that automatic repayment. So they have the direct withdrawal on their repayments. There is also some circumstances where a student may be eligible for loan forgiveness through the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. And that can be by working a certain amount of years in a public position. So with the state, local or federal agency. And there's information on that available also at that studentaid.gov. Studentaid.gov is a great website to go to if you have any questions or want any details on any of this. With the federal Parent Plus loan, they have that same interest rate incentive where they can reduce the interest rate by 0.25% with the automatic repayment. Private lenders, they also may have that interest rate reduction as well for the automatic repayment. They may have other repayment incentives as well. It just depends on that lender. So it is going to be different between lenders. What is nice with those two is a lot of them have what's called a cosigner release, which means after a certain amount of payments, the cosigner can come off the loan. So that can be attractive for parents sometimes who don't want funds in their name forever. They're helping their student until they don't have to anymore. There can be a graduation bonus or even on-time payment credits. So lots of different incentives with those. Again, just depending on the lender. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of what those origination fees are. So again, the Department of Education for the federal loans does have that origination fee. So we, looked at the chart earlier for those subsidized or unsubsidized loan for a student. If they're requesting $5,500, there's going to be an origination fee of approximately $59 that comes out of that. So what would actually be applied to their education would be the $5,441. So that's something to keep in mind, only because if a student has a $5,500 bill at the school and they think their loan's going to pay that full amount, there would be that gap of the $59. Parent Plus loan, the origination fee is a little higher for the Parent Plus loan. So if they borrow, for example, again, $10,000, their origination fee is going to be $423. So only $9,577 would actually disperse to the student account. So they do have to take, again, those into consideration. And a lot of schools on their website will even have a calculator that you can go to, and it'll show you if I borrow this much, how much will actually be the net, and it'll do that origination fee for you, which is nice. Private education loans, that's one benefit. They do not have an origination fee in most cases. So with that, if you borrow the $10,000, the $10,000 is going to apply to the account. If we can go on to the next slide. I'm going to turn it back over to Faith for resources. I know that was a mouthful, but again, if you have any questions or want any additional information, the studentaids.gov is a good place to go for additional information.
Thanks, Veronica. That was a lot of information. That was great. All right, so we're getting toward the end of our webinar, and we want to tell you about the resources that we have available for college access and school counselors. We do have a contact database. It's not the best. We need you to actually enter your name and email address into it so that we can make sure that you have access to workshop registration reminders, how to sign up for them, other events and details, and training announcements. So if you will contact the contact database is on the owasco.org website. If you are not already in our database, please go in and add your name and email address so that we can make sure that we have you in there getting all of our information. Here are all of the counselor resources that we update this website fairly frequently, so please visit it frequently. But we put out here, some of the webinars that we've already done. We put the recordings out here. This recording will also go up on this resource page. So if any of your colleagues were unable to attend today, they could still view the webinar. We will also add, when we put the recording up there, we will add this PowerPoint slide deck up there. So if you want to go in and download a copy of it, you may do so. There are, this is where we list, when we do our counselor workshops in the fall, we list all of those. We have upcoming events that will be listed here. Just many resources that we keep adding here for counselors that you can access. We also create each year a FAFSA priority deadline for Ohio schools. So the outreach committee reaches out to all of the colleges, universities in the state of Ohio and asks them to update this priority deadline sheet so that you can go and access it and you can help your students know, so John Carroll had a FAFSA priority date of December the 1st. Keep in mind, we call it a deadline sheet, but the FAFSA has basically a year and a half that you can submit the FAFSA. So even if the school's priority date has passed, the student can still submit the FAFSA form. Schools will use those priority dates to, one, get students to get those FAFSA submitted in a timely manner, and so that we can get financial aid offers out as soon as possible, but also because we have small funds of money that tend to go to those students that meet those priority dates. So you can look at this deadline sheet and see, that John Carroll has a priority date. Their date was December the 1st. They don't require a supplemental form. Their awarding is rolling. So you can help your students know, which schools have these priority dates and what to expect. Some schools don't have a priority date, so they can continue to submit the FAFSA and benefit from not having that date. So some new resources we have a cost and financial aid comparison worksheet. We have the priority deadline sheet. We have the FAFSA completion tool by high school. We have the information that we talked about earlier in this webinar out there on our website. How to access the Ohio student record data, financial aid toolkit, students that are using the training voucher, and student data and identity theft. So, many other resources that we have available to you out there on the oasfa.org website under resources. There's also a resources page for students and parents that you can link to your school or access website if you would like. We put a lot of videos that FSA has created on how to create the FSA ID, how to complete the FAFSA form, just some quick videos that families may want to view to get more help in the financial aid process. So we are at just a few minutes before 10, and we were scheduled to go for an hour and a half. I don't see that any questions have been put into the question and answer box. I would like to offer you an opportunity to ask any questions you may have now that you've sat through this. If you want to raise your hand, I can unmute you and allow you to ask your question if you would like to do that. And I'll just give everyone a few minutes to think about doing that. Raise your hand or put a note in the Q&A that you would like to ask a question out loud or make a comment. I mean, we know that we gave you a lot of information, but we also want to just kind of arm you as students will start to get those financial aid offers and they might be bringing them into you. Veronica covered a lot of detail about what the award notification looks like, especially the differences in the loans. And FSA has done a really good job at studentaid.gov of putting that information out on that website. All right, so I'm seeing some comments in the chat. When do you anticipate the FAFSA will be determined on the previous tax year as opposed to being 2 years behind? We have no reason to believe that will be changing. That used to be the case years ago, and probably about 4 or 5 years ago, we went to the prior year, which is 2 years out. And one of the reasons we did that was because the tax year is completed. So the 2020 tax year is completed when the FAFSA goes live in October. So I don't anticipate that FSA is going to go back to the previous tax year. That's why schools have that special circumstance appeal or that income appeal. So if that prior year is not indicative of the current family situation, they would want to reach out to the school's financial aid office and discuss having us do an appeal based on their current or even their projected income. So I have no reason to believe that we're going back to the previous tax year. As a matter of fact, you may or may not have heard that there is a FAFSA simplification process in process right now, that by the 24-25 year, a lot of things will be changing, but that is not one of them that we have heard. Anyone else have any questions or comments? Well, we thank you all very much for attending and taking time out of your day to join us for this webinar. Please keep an eye out in your emails for more training opportunities. This pretty much is wrapping up what we will be doing for the year, since we're well into the financial aid year. But we will be gathering and regrouping coming this fall and doing more workshops this fall. And if anything changes in the meantime, we certainly will be reaching out to you and making that offer. So thank you all for attending.